You ever notice how the most important man in the room is usually the one nobody sees? The question floated lightly through the dry afternoon air, lost between the sharp cadence of commands and the steady rhythm of boots striking gravel, but the man standing at the edge of the training field did not seem to need an answer, because he had already lived it. Arthur Hayes stood just beyond the painted boundary line, his posture relaxed, his hands resting loosely at his sides, a faded jacket hanging from his shoulders as if it belonged to another time, and around him, the world moved. Without pause, young soldiers running drills with precision and speed, their movements clean, practiced, efficient, every action shaped by repetition and expectation, yet none of them looked at him, not even once, as if he were part of the background, something fixed and unimportant. Private Evan Cole moved through the line with sharp focus, his boots landing in exact rhythm, his eyes locked forward, his posture aligned with everything he had been trained to be, fast, efficient, certain, and when he passed within a few feet of Arthur, there was no hesitation, no glance, not even the smallest acknowledgement, just movement, continuous and uninterrupted, as if the space Arthur occupied did not require recognition. The wind moved across the range in slow, uneven waves, carrying dust along the ground and brushing lightly against uniforms, lifting the edge of Arthur's jacket for a moment before letting it fall back into place, and he watched, not the soldiers themselves, but the space between them, the timing of their steps, the slight shifts in weight, the patterns that repeated with quiet predictability, his eyes steady, focused, not searching for attention, not expecting anything from the world moving around him. A command rang out sharply, cutting through the air, and the formation adjusted instantly, rifles lifting in unison, bodies aligning with practiced precision, and still, Arthur remained outside of it all, unmoving, untouched by the rhythm that defined everything else on the field. Evan completed his cycle and reset, stepping back into position with controlled breath, his expression composed, confident, and for a brief second, his path brought him near Arthur again, close enough that a single glance would have been effortless, but none came, because in his world, relevance was defined by structure, by rank, by visible authority, and Arthur Hayes carried none of those things. The sun hung high, casting hard light across the range, creating sharp contrasts between movement and stillness, between those who belonged and those who did not, and Arthur stood in that contrast without resistance, without reaction, as if the lack of acknowledgement was not something new, not something unexpected, but simply another moment passing through a life that had long since learned to exist without needing to be seen, somewhere down the line. A slight misalignment occurred, subtle enough that it did not break the drill, but enough to ripple through the timing for a fraction of a second, and Arthur's gaze shifted, not quickly, not urgently, but with quiet precision, following the change as if it mattered, even though no one else noticed, and then, just as calmly, he returned to stillness, the pattern settling again, the rhythm continuing, the soldiers moving forward as if nothing had happened, as if the man standing at the edge of their world had not seen something they had missed, had not understood something they did not yet realize was there, and the moment passed, unnoticed by everyone except the one who had never needed to be part of it to understand it. The rhythm of the range continued without hesitation, commands rising and falling with practiced certainty, boots striking the ground in steady cadence, and yet something small had shifted, something subtle enough that no one named it, but present enough that it lingered beneath the surface of every movement. Private Evan Cole reset his stance again, drawing in a measured breath as he prepared for the next sequence, his posture sharp, his focus fixed straight ahead, but the precision he relied on now carried a faint tension, a barely noticeable tightening that came not from error, but from something he could not quite place. Arthur Hayes had not moved, not even a step, and yet his presence seemed to stretch further across the field than before, not through action, not through voice, but through the quiet way his eyes followed the patterns unfolding in front of him, tracing each movement as if the entire exercise were a language he understood fluently, even if no one else recognized it. A command snapped through the air and the line adjusted instantly, rifles lifting in unison, shoulders aligning, timing locking into place, but just at the edge of that synchronization, there was a fraction of a second where the motion felt forced, a slight compression in the rhythm that did not break the drill, but dulled its flow, and Arthur's gaze settled on it, steady, patient, as if waiting to see whether anyone else would notice. Evan moved again, stepping forward with controlled precision, his boots landing exactly where they should, his movements technically correct, yet there was a stiffness now, a subtle resistance in the way his body carried the motion, and as he completed the sequence, he exhaled slightly sharper than before, resetting with a quick adjustment that went unnoticed by the others. The wind passed across the range once more, lifting dust in low, drifting lines, and for a moment, it seemed to slow the entire scene, softening the edges of movement, blurring the boundary between action and stillness, and in that brief shift, Arthur spoke, not loudly, not with authority, but with the same quiet clarity that had marked everything about him. "You are holding the tension too long," he said, the words simple, almost weightless, and yet they carried across the space with enough presence to reach Evan directly. Evan paused, just for a fraction of a second, the words catching him mid-reset, his eyes flicking slightly to the side before returning forward, as if unsure whether he had actually heard them, and the drill continued around him, the formation moving, the commands repeating, but something in him held on to that sentence, turning it over without fully understanding why. No one else reacted, no one acknowledged the interruption, because in the structure they followed, voices like that did not belong, they did not register, and yet the effect lingered, subtle but persistent, as Evan stepped forward again, his breath coming slower this time, his posture adjusting without conscious decision, and when he completed the sequence once more, the movement felt different, smoother, less forced, as if something had released without needing to be named. Arthur did not watch him specifically, did not track the change with any visible reaction, he simply returned to stillness, his gaze once again taking in the entire field, the patterns, the timing, the spaces between movements, as if the correction had not been an act, but a natural response to something that had always been there, and around them, the range continued, commands echoing, boots striking, the structure holding as it always had, but beneath it, just beneath the surface, the shift remained, quiet, steady, growing in a way no one had yet fully recognized, except for the man who had never needed to be part of the system to understand how it moved. The adjustment did not disappear after that moment, it settled deeper instead, threading itself into the rhythm of the range in a way that could not be undone, and Private Evan Cole felt it without understanding why, a subtle shift in the way his body moved, the way his breath aligned with each command, as if something had quietly recalibrated beneath the surface. The drills continued, commands sharp and precise, the formation holding its structure, yet the timing now carried a faint difference. A smoother edge that had not been there before, and Evan noticed it not as improvement, but as ease, as if a layer of resistance had been removed without effort. Arthur Hayes remained still, his presence unchanged, standing just beyond the painted boundary, watching not with intensity, not with focus on any one soldier, but with a broader awareness that seemed to hold the entire field at once, his eyes moving slowly, deliberately, tracing patterns that others did not see. A slight inconsistency emerged again, further down the line this time, a soldier transitioning just a fraction too early, his movement clean but out of sync with the rest, and the ripple passed through the formation almost invisibly, absorbed into the drill without correction, because it did not break the structure, it only weakened its precision. Arthur's gaze settled on that moment, not reacting, not signaling, simply observing, and after a brief pause, he spoke again, his voice low, even, carrying just enough to reach without interrupting. "You are moving ahead of the command," he said, and the words landed softly, almost blending into the background noise of the range, yet the soldier hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, his timing catching on the edge of the statement, his eyes flicking forward as if searching for confirmation. No command followed, no official correction came, and yet on the next repetition, the movement adjusted, the timing aligning more precisely with the group, the flow tightening in a way that was not dramatic, but unmistakable. Evan saw it this time, not directly, not by watching Arthur, but by feeling the difference in the rhythm around him, the way the formation seemed to settle more cleanly into itself, and something in him shifted again, not enough to change his posture, not enough to break his focus, but enough to make him aware that the man standing outside their system was influencing it in ways that did not require permission. The wind moved across the range, lifting dust and thin, drifting lines, softening the edges of movement, and for a brief moment, the entire field seemed to slow, the commands, the steps, the transitions all holding a fraction longer than before, and in that space, Evan's attention pulled slightly to the side, not fully, not enough to break discipline, but enough that he became aware of Arthur without looking directly at him, aware of the stillness, the quiet certainty that did not align with anything he had been trained to recognize. Arthur did not acknowledge the change, did not follow the soldier he had corrected, he simply returned to watching the whole. His posture relaxed, his expression steady, as if what he had said required no follow-up, no validation, because it was not offered as instruction, but as observation, and as the drill continued, as the formation held, as the commands repeated with unwavering consistency, the shift remained, growing quieter, deeper, settling into the foundation of the exercise in a way that no one had yet fully understood, except for the one man who had never needed to be part of it to see exactly where it could be better. The rhythm no longer felt untouched, even though the commands continued with the same sharp precision, even though every movement followed the structure that had been drilled into them, because something beneath it had changed, something subtle but persistent, and Private Evan Cole felt it now with every step, every breath, every reset, as if the system he trusted was being quietly adjusted by a presence it did not recognize. He moved through the sequence again, his posture aligned, his timing controlled, yet there was a new awareness in the way he carried himself, a hesitation not in action, but in certainty, because the smoothness he had found was not something he had been taught, it had come from somewhere else, somewhere just outside the line he was trained to follow. Arthur Hayes remained where he had been from the beginning. Standing just beyond the painted boundary, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady, watching not the individuals, but the flow between them, the invisible connections that shaped the drill more than the commands themselves, and there was no urgency in him, no need to correct or intervene, only a quiet recognition of what was already there. A command echoed across the range and the formation adjusted instantly, rifles lifting, bodies aligning, but this time the timing faltered slightly at the center, a small delay passing through two soldiers as they transitioned, not enough to disrupt the drill, but enough to dull its precision, and Evan saw it clearly now, not as an isolated mistake, but as part of a pattern, something recurring beneath the surface. Before any official correction could come, Arthur spoke again, his voice calm, measured, carrying just enough to reach. "You are reacting to the command, not anticipating it," he said, and the words settled into the space with quiet clarity, not interrupting, not demanding, simply existing, and the two soldiers hesitated briefly, their movements catching for a fraction of a second before continuing, but on the next repetition, the adjustment was there, subtle but undeniable, their timing aligning more cleanly with the rest of the formation. Evan felt it again, the shift, stronger this time, no longer something he could dismiss, and his attention pulled slightly toward the edge of the field, not enough to break discipline, but enough to acknowledge the source of the change, even if he did not fully understand it. The wind moved across the range, carrying dust in soft, uneven waves, and for a moment, it seemed to slow everything down, the commands, the steps, the transitions all stretching just enough to reveal the gaps between them, and in that space, the difference became clearer, the contrast between forced precision and natural flow, between following instructions and understanding them. Arthur did not look for recognition, did not follow the soldiers he had corrected, he simply returned to stillness, his presence unchanged, as if what he had said required nothing further, as if the impact spoke for itself. And as the drill continued, as the formation held, as the structure remained intact, something deeper had begun to shift, not in the system itself, but in the way it was experienced, the way it was felt. And for the first time, Evan Cole understood that the man standing just beyond the boundary was not outside the system at all, he was seeing it from a place the system itself could not reach, and that realization settled quietly into him, not loud, not immediate, but steady, like a truth that had been there all along, waiting to be noticed. The shift had moved beyond subtlety now, not in a way that broke the structure of the range, but in a way that redefined how it was felt, how it was understood, and Private Evan Cole could no longer ignore it, because every movement he made carried the imprint of something that had not come from command, not from repetition, but from the quiet presence standing just beyond the line. The drills continued, commands rising and falling with practiced authority, yet there was a hesitation woven into the rhythm, not visible, not measurable, but present, and it showed in the way soldiers reset their stance just a fraction slower, in the way their breathing adjusted without being told, as if each of them had begun to sense that precision was not only about following orders, but about understanding something deeper beneath them. Arthur Hayes remained exactly where he had been from the beginning, unmoved, unbothered, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady, watching the entire field with a calm Awareness that did not seek attention, and yet now, attention was beginning to find him, not openly, not directly, but in the small shifts of perception that pulled toward him despite discipline. Evan stepped forward again, executing the sequence with control, but this time his focus was divided, not outwardly, not enough to break form, but inwardly, where a question had begun to form, not about what he was doing, but about how it felt, about why the smallest adjustments had made such a difference. And as he completed the motion, his breath steadied in a way that felt more natural than before, less forced, less rigid. A nearby soldier faltered slightly, his transition catching for a brief moment, and before any official correction came, Arthur's voice carried across the space once more, calm, even. "You are forcing the timing," he said, and the words landed softly, almost blending into the background. Yet the soldier paused just long enough to absorb them, his movement adjusting on the next repetition, smoother, more aligned, and this time, the effect was noticed, not loudly, not openly, but in the way several soldiers held their position just a fraction longer, their awareness sharpening, their attention pulling subtly toward the edge of the field. Evan felt it clearly now, the quiet pull of recognition, and for the first time, he allowed his gaze to shift, just slightly, just enough to acknowledge the man who had been standing there all along. And what he saw did not match the image he had dismissed earlier, not the out-of-place figure beyond the boundary, but something else entirely, something grounded, something certain, a presence that did not need to assert itself to be real. Arthur did not meet his gaze, did not acknowledge the shift. He remained as he had been, calm, steady, observing, as if the changes unfolding around him were not the result of his presence, but the natural correction of something that had always been slightly off. The wind moved again across the range, carrying dust in soft, drifting patterns, and the entire field seemed to settle into a quieter rhythm, one that no longer felt forced, one that flowed more naturally between command and execution, and in that moment, the distance between Arthur Hayes and the soldiers was no longer defined by the painted line on the ground, but by something else entirely, something invisible that was slowly closing, not through authority, not through recognition, but through understanding that had not yet been spoken aloud, but was already taking shape in the silence. The shift did not fade, it deepened, settling into the space between command and movement, into the way each soldier carried their weight, into the way each breath aligned with something that could no longer be explained by routine alone, and Private Evan Cole felt it more clearly now with every step he took, every motion he completed, because the ease he had found was no longer something he could dismiss as coincidence. The range continued with its structured precision, commands echoing across the open field, boots striking in disciplined rhythm, but beneath that structure, something quieter had taken hold, something that did not belong to instruction but to awareness, and it changed the way everything felt without altering how anything looked. Arthur Hayes remained exactly where he had been from the beginning, still beyond the painted boundary, still outside the system that defined everyone else, and yet now his presence seemed to anchor the entire field in a way that no one could openly acknowledge, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged, as if the moment unfolding had been expected long before it began. A slight delay passed through the formation again, this time at the far end of the line, a soldier hesitating just enough to disrupt the flow, and before the correction could come from the usual chain of command, Arthur spoke once more. His voice low and even, "You are waiting for confirmation," he said, and the words carried across the range with quiet clarity, reaching the soldier without breaking the rhythm of the drill, and the adjustment came on the next movement, subtle but precise, the hesitation gone, the timing restored in a way that felt natural rather than forced. Evan saw it happen, not as an isolated moment, but as part of a pattern that had been building, and for the first time, he understood that the man standing beyond the line was not simply observing, he was guiding something deeper, something that could not be taught through repetition alone, and that realization settled into him with a quiet weight, not disruptive, but undeniable. The wind moved again across the field, lifting dust into soft, drifting waves, and the entire range seemed to hold for a fraction longer than before, as if the space itself was adjusting to the shift that had taken place, the rhythm now smoother, more connected, less rigid in a way that could not be seen but could be felt by everyone standing within it. And then, beneath the sound of commands and movement, another sound began to rise, low and steady, distant at first, but unmistakable, the hum of approaching vehicles carrying across the open ground, and the effect was immediate, posture tightening, movements sharpening, attention redirecting without the need for instruction, because this was something they all recognized. Something that followed a different kind of authority. Evan straightened instinctively, his focus snapping forward, the earlier shift within him pushed aside by the structure he knew, and the formation adjusted in unison, the rhythm of the drill dissolving into controlled stillness as the sound grew closer. Arthur did not move, did not turn, his posture unchanged even as the atmosphere shifted around him, and that stillness stood in quiet contrast to everything else, to the tightening lines, the sharpened awareness, the anticipation that filled the air. The vehicles came into view at the edge of the range, dark shapes moving with measured precision, and the moment settled into something new, something heavier, something that carried with it the sense that everything that had happened before was only preparation for what was about to unfold, and as the engine slowed and the doors began to open, the silence that followed was not empty, but expectant, as if the entire field understood, without words, that the next moment would change everything. The doors opened without haste, one after another, each movement controlled, deliberate, and the moment the first boot touched the gravel, the atmosphere across the entire range shifted in a way that no command could replicate, because presence like this did not need to be announced, it was recognized. General Richard Donovan stepped forward from the vehicle with measured calm, his posture steady, his gaze already moving across the field before anyone had spoken, and every soldier felt it, the subtle weight of authority settling over them, tightening their stance, sharpening their focus, drawing the entire formation into a stillness that held more meaning than motion ever could. Private Evan Cole stood rigid, his earlier thoughts pushed aside by instinct, his training taking over as his attention locked forward, yet even within that structure, he felt the lingering awareness from before. The quiet shift that had not disappeared, only waiting beneath the surface. The formation held perfectly, boots aligned, rifles steady, every movement paused in anticipation, and Staff Sergeant Noah Blake stepped slightly forward, his posture firm, his eyes tracking the general with precise awareness, because there was something different in the way Donovan moved, something that did not match the routine of an inspection. The general's steps were unhurried, each one placed with quiet certainty as he crossed the range, his gaze scanning not just the formation, but the space itself, the lines, the rhythm, the subtle details that others might overlook, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if he was confirming something rather than searching for it. Evan followed that gaze without meaning to, his attention shifting just slightly, and as he did, he felt the realization begin to form, slow and steady, because the direction was becoming clear, the path the general was taking not toward the center of the formation, not toward command, but toward the edge, toward the boundary that had separated one man from the rest since the beginning. Arthur Hayes had not moved, not even as the highest authority on the field approached, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, as if the moment unfolding around him did not require adjustment, and that stillness stood in sharp contrast to everything else, to the tightened lines, the sharpened awareness, the anticipation that filled the air. Donovan slowed as he neared the midpoint of the range, his steps becoming more deliberate, the distance between him and Arthur closing gradually, and the silence deepened with each movement, stretching across the field, holding every soldier in place, because whatever this moment was becoming, it had moved beyond routine, beyond expectation. Blake felt it fully now, the quiet certainty settling into him, the sense that something long unspoken was about to surface. And Evan felt it too, not as understanding, not yet, but as a shift in the weight of the moment, a realization that the man he had once ignored was now the center of something far greater than he had imagined. The general came to a stop a few feet from Arthur Hayes, the motion complete, the space between them defined not by distance, but by recognition that had not yet been spoken, and for a brief second, nothing happened, no command, no acknowledgement, only the stillness of two figures standing across from each other while the entire range held its breath, because in that silence, the moment reached its edge, and what came next would not need explanation to be understood. The silence did not break, it deepened, stretching across the entire range with a weight that pressed into every soldier standing in formation, and General Richard Donovan remained still for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on Arthur Hayes as if confirming something that had already been decided long before this day, long before this field, and the wind moved softly between them, lifting dust in slow drifting lines that seemed to pause in the air, as if even the environment understood that what was about to happen would not belong to routine. Private Evan Cole felt his breath tighten without realizing it, his posture locked in place, his eyes forward but his awareness fully drawn to the edge of the field, because the distance between the two men had become the center of everything, and no one moved, no one spoke, not even the faintest adjustment broke the moment. Donovan's shoulders shifted slightly, not into command, not into authority, but into something quieter, something more deliberate, and his hand rose slowly, not rushed, not dramatic, but with a precision that carried intention, and as it moved, the entire field seemed to narrow around it. Every soldier watching without looking, every mind fixed on the motion that was unfolding without instruction. Arthur Hayes did not react, did not change his posture, his gaze steady, his presence unchanged, as if the movement happening in front of him did not require acknowledgement, as if it was not something being given, but something returning. The general's hand reached its position, firm, exact, and then it held there, a salute, clean and unmistakable, offered without hesitation, without explanation, and the impact of that single action moved through the range faster than any command ever could, not as sound, but as realization, as understanding that settled instantly into every person present. Evan felt it before he could process it, the sudden shift that replaced everything he had assumed, everything he had believed about what mattered on this field, and he remained perfectly still, but the meaning of that stillness had changed, no longer just discipline, but recognition, because the man he had ignored was now standing at the center of something that required no introduction. Staff Sergeant Noah Blake lowered his gaze slightly, not in confusion, but in quiet acknowledgement, the final confirmation locking into place, and across the formation, the soldiers held their positions with a stillness that was no longer imposed, but chosen, because they understood, even without knowing the details, that what they were witnessing was not ordinary. Donovan did not lower the salute immediately. He held it for a fraction longer than necessary, just enough to mark the moment as something more than protocol, something that carried weight beyond rank, and Arthur Hayes remained unchanged, his posture relaxed, his expression calm, as if the recognition now filling the space was not something new, but something that had always been there, waiting to be seen. And in that silence, with the salute held steady and the entire field frozen in quiet understanding, the moment completed itself without a single word, because nothing needed to be said for the truth to be fully known. The salute did not drop immediately, it held in the air for a moment longer than protocol required, and in that extended second, everything that had been unclear became undeniable, not through explanation, not through words, but through the quiet weight of recognition that settled across the entire range. General Richard Donovan lowered his hands slowly, deliberately, the motion controlled, and as it returned to his side, he did not step back, did not turn away, he shifted instead, just enough to stand beside Arthur Hayes, aligning himself not in command, but in acknowledgement, and that subtle movement carried more meaning than anything that could have been spoken. Private Evan Cole felt the shift fully now, not as confusion, not as tension, but as clarity, the kind that arrives without warning and leaves no room for doubt, and he remained at attention, but the posture no longer felt like routine, it felt like respect, real and grounded, directed not by rank, but by understanding. The formation held in perfect stillness, every soldier locked in place, but the silence between them had changed. It was no longer empty, it was full, filled with the awareness of something that had been invisible only moments before, something that had stood at the edge of their world and had now become its center. Staff Sergeant Noah Blake lowered his head slightly, not in submission, not in confusion, but in quiet acknowledgement, a recognition of truth that did not require confirmation, and across the line, others followed in their own subtle ways, small adjustments in posture, in breath, in focus, each one reflecting the same realization. Arthur Hayes remained unchanged, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady, as if nothing about the moment had altered him, as if the recognition now surrounding him was not something new, but something that had always existed, waiting patiently for the right moment to be seen. The wind moved once more across the range, softer now, carrying with it the faint rustle of fabric and dust, and the field seemed to settle into a new stillness, one that did not belong to command, but to understanding. And General Donovan stood beside Arthur without speaking, without explanation, because none was needed. The salute had already said everything. Evan allowed his eyes to shift, just for a brief moment, and this time he looked directly at Arthur Hayes, not past him, not through him, but at him, and what he saw was not the man he had ignored, not the figure outside the system, but something else entirely, something that did not need to prove itself to exist, and he straightened slightly, the movement small but deliberate, a silent correction of his own. No orders were given, no speeches followed, and yet the entire range understood that something had changed permanently. Something that would not reset when the drills resumed, something that would remain long after the moment had passed, and as the silence held for just a second longer before the world inevitably began to move again, one truth settled quietly into every soldier standing there, that respect was never created in that instant, it had only been revealed, because some honors are not given in the present, they are returned from the past.